Go to resuming debate then. The honourable member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud to rise today to speak to the third reading of Bill C-30, the implementing legislation for the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and the European Union, otherwise known as CETA. Now, I know there are those in this House who are quick to dismiss the opposition to this trade agreement, but I would remind all members that this is the People's House, and these concerns deserve to have their say here in the heart of our democracy. Hear, hear. I also find it interesting that in today's debate, Liberal members of Parliament have decided to sit out and leave the heavy lifting to the NDP and the Conservatives. Perhaps they've grown tired of trying to defend this supposedly progressive trade deal. Be that as it may, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to stand here today to provide a reasoned and principled progressive opposition to this implementation bill. Now, I want to start my speech by talking about the rushed process that this bill has gone through, and I would go back to the solemn promise that the Prime Minister made in his Open and Accountable Government publication that ministers were to treat Parliament with respect and provide the necessary information for us to do our job. And I quote from that, "Clear ministerial accountability to Parliament is fundamental to responsible government and requires that ministers provide Parliament with the information it needs to fulfill its roles of legislating, approving the appropriation of funds, and holding the government to account. The Prime Minister expects ministers to demonstrate respect and support for the parliamentary process." End quote. Now then, we look what happened with Bill C-30. So on October the 30th of 2016, the Prime Minister signed CETA at the Leaders Summit, the Canada-EU Leaders Summit. And, you know, the implementing legislation was basically put forward on October 31st. And this rush process violated the government's own policy on the tabling of treaties in Parliament, which requires the government to table a copy of the treaty along with an explanatory memorandum outlining key components of the treaty at least 21 sitting days before the legislation is presented. So just one more broken promise in a string of broken promises, and the fact that it violated its very own policy on this just shows how quickly this government forgets the principles for which it was elected for. And we are also aware that all is not well amongst the members of the European Union. We know that there have been several protests with over 100,000 people in attendance at each. In fact, a German constitutional challenge against CETA has garnered 125,000 signatures, and a recently launched referendum campaign in the Netherlands has collected over 200,000 signatures. I do not believe that this opposition can be pegged simply on a rising tide of protectionism. There are very concrete reasons why people are opposed to CETA. And what we have here is that Parliament is essentially being asked to write a blank check with this legislation, to give the government the power to go ahead with it, when we still know that each one of the 28 member states of the EU has to ratify this, and it's a process that's expected to take anywhere from 2 to 5 years. So again, the question is, why do we have this rushed process? Now, to get to the crux of our opposition to this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, now it's about the investor-state dispute, the investor court system that is part of this agreement. New Democrats support trade deals that reduce tariffs and boost exports. And if only we had a trade deal that was doing just that. But when we have components like investor-state provisions that threaten the sovereignty of our country, the ability of our country to make laws for the good of this place and its people, we believe those have no place in trade deals. And the investor court system still allows foreign investors to seek compensation from any level of government over policy decisions that they feel impact their profits. Now, earlier, Mr. Speaker, I had an exchange with the member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, on the rule of law. And, you know, I think the rule of law has 3 constituent components to it: legality, democracy, and human rights. Now, legality has to do with the fact that The bills are passed in a democratically elected House of Commons. They have a process they go through, first, second, and third reading, and royal assent and so on. The democracy comes from the fact that the members of this House who propose laws are democratically elected and are accountable to the people. And the constitutionality comes from the fact that all laws that we make in this place are subject to the Constitution of Canada and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, our argument over the democratic accountability of the investor court system, I think he misinterpreted what I was trying to get at, because I feel that when you have an investor court system that can supersede the democratically elected people's representatives, be they at the municipal level or the provincial level or at the federal level, that does not satisfy my definition of the rule of law. I think the rule of law is being superseded by a system that is profoundly undemocratic. Never mind that it was set up by an elected majority, which, by the way, got there with 39% of the vote. It's the fact that it is able to overturn or sue smaller levels of government precisely because of the way they are acting. And if I can give a perfect example for my constituents in Cowichan-Malahat-Langford, we have a contaminated soil dump that is causing great grief to the local community. It's a gravel area which is now taking in contaminated soil, and the company in question is, of course, receiving money for all of the contaminated soil they're bringing in. The local government and even the provincial government have realized the error of their ways, and now there may be a process afoot where they're trying to reverse that contaminated soil. If we had an agreement in place like CETA, and that if that was a foreign company operating there, they could basically sue the local government, sue the provincial government for the loss in profits for dumping contaminated soil in an area that supplies drinking water to a local community. Where in all that is logical does that make sense, Mr. Speaker? So that, for the residents of Cowichan-Malahat-Langford, my home riding, that just puts it in perspective of what this could allow foreign companies to do. Now, the other thing that we in the NDP have gone over, of course, is the pharmaceutical costs. You know, I used to serve as the New Democratic Party critic and spokesperson for seniors, and I've handed that off to the member for North Island Pell River, and she's doing a great job on that. But we have testimony from, you know, the Canadian Generic Pharmaceutical Association. I would argue an association that is an expert on this subject, and they had a study that was prepared for them, showed that you know, if adopted, the proposals in this agreement would delay the introduction of new generic medicines in Canada by an average of 3.5 years. And the cost to pharmaceutical payers of this delay was estimated at a cost of $2.8 billion annually based on generic prices in 2010. I feel that, you know, I've been helping seniors in my local riding for many years. Before I was a member of Parliament, I worked as a constituency assistant, and I saw firsthand how seniors are struggling with the cost of living. And many of them, when it comes to the high cost of pharmaceutical drugs, either don't take their dosage or they take less than is what recommended by a doctor. This can lead to cascading health effects down the line. So why in the world would we institute a system which is going to increase the cost of pharmaceuticals when all the talk in Parliament these days, a lot of pressure is how do we institute a national system, a national pharmacare system to bring these costs down? So it seems to be at odds. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we know that from our conversations with small businesses, the small businesses in my riding, we know they want more consistency, we know they want fewer regulations, standards that are simple to comply with, simple border processes, less paperwork, and lower costs. So if we had a trade deal that was actually just about trade, about making sure those tariffs were being lowered and the free movement of goods, we can deal with that. But this implementing legislation contains a laundry list of acts of Parliament and regulations that are going to have to be changed. It's a 140-page bill, and it goes way beyond trade. We believe that greater access to European markets is great for Canadian goods, but just as with the TPP, CETA is a massive trade and investment deal that makes significant changes to investor rights, intellectual property, pharmaceutical, drugs, and more. I believe that Canada must maintain its sovereignty over the ability to make policy for the good of this country and its residents, and I will stand and defend that for as long as I can. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I really believe that the CETA trade deal is a good thing because the Europeans, at the end of the day, are a country, or not a country, but the European Union is a group of countries which share many of the similar values that we have here in Canada. And not only that, I believe it offers the opportunity of creating more jobs and the potential for high-skilled jobs in our country. I was just wondering how the member can justify throwing away that potential for that future potential growth that we could have in the number of employment or jobs that we could have in this country.
Honourable member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Well, Mr. Speaker, no one on this side is advocating that we throw that opportunity away. We're simply asking that with those key components like the cost of pharmaceuticals to our seniors, I would like to know how that meshes with his government's plan for a national pharmacare plan. And the fact that we can have this investor court system somehow challenge the laws that our local municipalities and local provincial governments make for the good of our citizens. If we were able to remove that specific provision, absolutely we'd start looking. And I agree with the member. I think trade with Europe is absolutely important. We have a common history, a common culture. A lot of us speak the same language. These are countries that we want to do business. They are democratically elected governments and so on. But because of the provisions I outlined in my speech, we have to maintain, on this side of the House, a principled opposition for those very reasons.
Questions and comments?